Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. Yesterday, we did a sort of an impromptu mini podcast on a Twitter space, called Twitter Spaces, and I've been a little confused about whether to use the plural or the singular. But basically, that's where you do basically it is a live audio broadcast on the Twitter platform. And then if you're on Twitter, you can, kind of join and listen to it. And they have it set up where, if you want to, you can have bring people on to ask questions and all that kind of stuff. So we did that yesterday, and if you were one of the listeners and heard about our podcast for the first time, and this is the first time you're listening, well, welcome to the Josh Marshall Podcast. We're the co-hosts. I'm Josh Marshall. Kate Riga is my co-host. We're going to talk to Kate in a minute. What we're going to do today is we're going to dive right back into what we were talking about yesterday, and that is, it's hard. It's really hard right now for any issue to, kind of clear the decks of political conversation. You've got this very risky land war in the eastern corner of Europe going on that is a really big deal. You've got all the things that we were talking about in U.S. domestic politics before. God, I'm losing track. I guess this came out, before Monday. But the Roe news, that's something that can clear the decks. Maybe not entirely clear the decks of the stuff going on in Ukraine, but really clear the decks. And it was the big political conversation yesterday, and I want to be clear that it's anybody who has been watching this issue closely, that the idea that Roe was going to be overturned this summer is not at all a surprise. It was all but guaranteed. I think the only question was whether you might have something that, in effect, did away with Roe, but didn't technically overturn the decision. And as we learned over the last couple of days, that seems to have been what John Roberts preferred. His, as best we know, his position on this, and we seem to know a fair amount, which is a whole other story we're going to get to. But to the extent we know his position, he was ready to affirm this Mississippi law that put a 15-week limit on legal abortion in the state. And for all sorts of mechanics, that makes abortion almost a nominal right, right? So that wasn't a surprise. And yet, seeing it in sort of black letter, right? Roe is, I forget the term that, the actual word for word that Justice Alito used, something like, we judge that Roe must be overturned or is overturned or something like that. You see the actual letters and it kind of hits with a bang. And what we didn't completely know, although I think it was assumed, is that at least this draft version, and it's important to remember, this is a draft version from February, and it is certainly conceivable that someone in Alito's position would start with a very aggressive opinion and then kind of negotiate from there. Not that you're going to end up with Roe not being overturned. That's clearly the decision. But as Kate and I were talking about yesterday, there's it's not the text of that opinion is not even really an analysis and a decision. It's kind of like a drop kick of the original Roe and Casey reasoning. It's basically just Roe was stupid. It was badly argued. It was bad constitutional reasoning. It was wrong. It fucked up the country. It was, and Alito, again, for those who follow these things, Roe is contained within and expanded a jurisprudence of privacy that gets underway in the middle of the 20th century in the Supreme Court. And it's why you have a right to contraception. You can't have laws that make contraception illegal. Same underlying privacy stuff. It's also why you have marriage equality. It's all sorts of stuff that have to do with reproductive rights, rights of erotic association, matrimonial rights, all come down to this thing. And in the decision, Alito basically just says that was all bogus. That whole thing was bogus. All that privacy stuff never really existed. The court made it up. It was wrong. Now, he doesn't have they don't have within this case a foothold to say that as a conclusive statement to overturn all those other decisions I'm talking about. But the decision as written makes pretty clear that the 5 justices who seem to be on board with this opinion, all those things are gone. So it's very aggressive. Again, it is some of it's a little hard to describe. It is if you read Supreme Court decisions over the years, and I mean over many decades, the Supreme Court, even when it wants to overturn a decision, often they will find their way to overturning the decision through the paths that the old jurisprudential reasoning had set forth. So, for instance, when Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy, it basically got there, got to overturning it by operating within a lot of the Plessy reasoning. Plessy basically, I mean, I think a good historical way of overturning Plessy would be to say the amendments are clear. You can't have separate but equal. It says it really says just as clear as day you can't do that. The Warren Court came at it, well, okay, separate but equal, got it. That's the thing. But it turns out separate is inherently unequal. Right? So this kind of way of you keep everything sort of evolutionary, even when substantively you're going in a very different direction. That was not Alito's approach. It was basically, if you read the text, it's basically kind of like in professional wrestling, it's like a body slam. It's kind of this is over. I'm going to take you out, throw you up in the air, and slam you down on the ground. So everybody's trying to make sense of that, and I think seeing it in the black letter and seeing that the opinion is really as aggressive as almost I think anybody could have imagined. And maybe there was some negotiation on the margins, since then. But I think the reason we can tell there has not been much is what we found out about where Roberts is now, not in February, that he wants something that is a little more incremental and minimalist. Usually you can find all sorts of different ways to come at these questions. You can find ways, and clearly Roberts thought he had found a way to affirm this Mississippi law, but not overturn Roe. And what seems clear is that those 5, no, they want to overturn Roe completely. So everything we know tells us almost to a certainty that is where those 5 are. So it's a done deal. It's a done deal. Possible there's some differences in the language and stuff like that. But it's a done deal, and the timeline on something like this is probably that decision comes out in like June, something like that. So 6 weeks, maybe as much as 8 weeks, possibly at the outside. So very soon. And that is where we are. And I think as we saw yesterday, uh, Republicans, Justice Alito wants to jump up and down, but most Republican elected officials, they don't really want to talk about it. It doesn't. They've got their win, right? They've used the that win on the horizon for 4 or 5 decades to to charge up Republican voters, Christian, kind of evangelical voters over this. But now they got it. So like there's no plus side in focusing on it, especially when you see the polls that show that when people are asked, should you get rid of Roe? Should you get rid of those rights? Period. Not like we're gonna, there's this one kind of really icky procedure you can do in the third trimester, and are you against that? Do you want to get rid of Roe? The polls are sort of like 70-30 on that. It's not popular. So what Republicans want to do is they want to talk about this leak, which is, I noticed over the last 24 hours or so that they have quickly coalesced. Not only is it like the biggest outrage in history, it's an insurrection. It's a judicial insurrection. It's treasonous. And the reality is, I mean, I guess, John Roberts they're going to do an investigation with, I guess, the Supreme Court has its own little mini police force. And they're going to do an investigation, and they can do that, obviously. And, in a professional and workplace context, it's a huge breach. There's no question about that. In a functional sense, maybe you can think it was the right thing to do, but in a just in a workplace context, you have professional confidences, blah 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 blah. But this isn't like classified information. It's not like you can go to jail for this. There's no different from like if you in your workplace like took a memo and showed it to someone. There's no laws about it. You can be fired, but whatever. So we're going to talk about all that. Before we do, if you can't handle the heat, get back to the kitchen, because with a glass of Grady's New Orleans style cold brew in your hand, I know this is a kind of a sharp transition from the end of Row to Grady's copy. So for everybody's benefit, I should have buffered it a little bit. But anyway, here we are. Because with a glass of Grady's New Orleans style cold brew in your hand, you'll be ready to tackle whatever sweaty situations pop up this summer. If your previous attempts at cold brewing were messy, bitter, or bland, don't worry. Grady's makes cold brewing consistent, easy, and mess-free. Their beanbag cold brew kit provides everything you need to make the perfect cup of iced coffee at home. And there's no need to buy any special coffee gadgets. You can brew it right inside the Grady's store and pour pouch and enjoy tasty iced coffee all summer long. Summerproof your fridge today at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM to save 25% off. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com. Use promo code TPM to save 25% off. Okay, Kate Riga, where are we've had a one whole day when we were going over this yesterday, and now we're on day two. Where are we?
Yeah, I think we should talk about, as you kind of mentioned in your intro, the language of the opinion before we move on to the content and the leak and everything. And the language, it's funny because in some ways it is completely predictable based on the very limited data set we have, and then in some ways it's this huge break in the conventional wisdom of just a few months ago. Because pre-oral argument, truly the leading thought was they're going to kill Roe by 1,000 cuts. And that theory made a lot of sense because red states have had great success all but ending abortion in their states already through things like, trap laws, like mandating that abortion providers have to jump through all these hoops and have hospital admitting privileges, and that things as granular as, counter height within the clinics. And that has been really successful. That's how we have huge swaths of the country where there's only one clinic to serve an entire state's population.
In like a
Um,
massive state, when like in one city you have one, but for your average person, it's like, okay, 5 hour drive. And then you got to
exactly.
come back the second day. And also in practice, in a lot of
Right.
America, there are no abortion rights even now.
Exactly. And how that was done was actually pretty ingenious. And granted, for a long time, states couldn't really pass these bans because before we had this court, it was just kind of, you were going to get struck down by a lower court, and that's that. Whereas they could get around it with these trap laws. But it worked really well because it also attracts basically no media attention because it's boring. Requirements on doctors and clinics, like that's a snooze. You're not going to have a headline that's you must use this kind of cleaning product in an abortion clinic. Um, so I think it flowed from that, the idea that the court would weaken and defang Roe in a way that was kind of boring, kind of procedural, damaging, but over the long term. And then we had the oral arguments in December, and all of that went out the window. John Roberts was the only one even kind of dithering over the 15-week question, which is the details of the ban that this case is about. The other justices didn't even pretend. The conservatives, they were very candid in treating this case like the opportunity to overturn Roe that it was, even then. And I think that was a big shift because I don't think it was crazy to think that the justices would be concerned about electoral backlash should they just wipe out Roe all at once. And they're so tightly at this point bound to Republican politics and politicians that that's not an off base thing to think, but just went out the window. And then we get this text, and like you say, caveats abound. Okay, it's a draft from February. We know that Alito, who's not exactly known for his temperance, is the one who wrote it, and we don't know that even the other justices who voted along with him in conference, we don't know that they've signed off on this language. So we might end up getting something more tempered as the final decision. But this document is just it's a victory lap. There's nothing in it that is seeks to soften the blow. There's really not much in it for people who are kind of concerned on the knock-on effects. I would say that periodically it's almost like he has a post-it on his computer and he'll remind himself to be like, oh, but other privacy rights are fine. Like, don't worry about it. This is not going to take away all your rights, even though the logic there is completely specious and missing. If all the rights flow from the same place, what's your intellectual grounding for saying that? But it's just, heaped up with sympathy for the anti-abortion movement, just full of it. And then all the stuff on the other side is so callous. There's one line where he says, women are not without electoral and political power, which is like, okay, one of our 9 kings who dictates all of human rights for this country. Thank you for saying that, I have a vote in DC. But it's just any any of that idea that they would seek to have this fly under the radar to avoid the potential electoral backlash, or back at a time when everyone was still talking about the integrity of the court, where they would be concerned about that's gone out the window. So, and now we can talk about the parlor game of who leaked it, what side is it better for, but at this point we've got this document, and when we get the final document, a lot of the reporting is going to be how did it change?
Right.
But we
Well, and
have this
yeah.
textual item. So I think that it was important, and it was striking even reading it that there is no attempt to not rub salt on the wounds here. This is just a dancing on the battlefield of dead bodies.
One thing that occurred to me, and one of the I what seemed more persuasive to me over time, that the logic of, the immediate assumption, I think almost everybody, was that this was one of the clerks of one of the Democratic appointed justices. Or I've always thought that too little attention has gone to, there's support staff. I don't know how many, but like I guarantee you it's not like the clerks are running the computer network and stuff like that. So there's other people who could potentially have access, but that was the original assumption. But over time, a number of former clerks make the argument the the real impact of this is that it makes it really hard to depart from this opinion, because you've kind of said this is the law, this is the fact, and especially if um this is why they don't want the opinions leaked. It's supposed to kind of come down from on high, right? When God delivered the 10 commandments, it would kind of it would kind of break the magic if you find out that there was 11 commandments first and then he did like a rewrite, right? And it's that's kind of that's sort of the razzmatazz that the court operates in. And for for how much the conservative legal movement has put into getting to this moment, that is kind of like, that's the maximal thing. And if you come out with something a little more mealy mouthed, then it's going to be, what happened? Why'd you guys go soft? What? So I think the reality is, we just have no idea who did this, and I don't think we have any way of finding out who did this unless they tell us. The person comes forward and tells us. We can. I think the logical impact of this is to firm up the extremity of that opinion. And so I think there is a good argument that it is more likely than not that it was someone who was favorable to this opinion. But we don't know the person who leaked had any idea what the impact would be. It's entirely plausible that the sort of the brainiac Harvard law graduate clerk of either of a Democratic or Republican justice was clueless about kind of near term political impact. So we just have no idea. Um, the one point I want to come back to, though, about the decision itself, and again, this really strikes me, is that I mentioned before about arguing within the existing paths, even if you're charting a new path. And the privacy doctrine is very complicated, but one key part of it is the people who developed this jurisprudence, again, in the middle of the 20th century, basically said that there are all these different constitutional protections about your right. You don't have to incriminate yourself. You have protections against um, just flagrant searches. There has to be, you need due process if the government is going to come and look at your stuff. You The government can't punish you in a cruel and unusual way. All these lots of, and those are only a few of the things. All these different things, basically, you put them together, and it's saying that we treat individuals as having a kind of a sanctity, and the government can't just kind of grab you and snap you in half like a stick because it wants to. You have this sort of kind of bodily and bodily autonomy. And what is that? That means there's kind of like a privacy. You have some shield against what the government can do to you. Not an absolute shield, but a shield. And that's where this privacy jurisprudence comes from. And again, it's much more complicated. There's arguments. I'm not even getting into the arguments about the 14th Amendment, blah 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 blah. But generally speaking, that's kind of how you get there. And there are ways, many very smart people, uh, uh, people, judges, legal academics, have made arguments why that is not good reasoning. You could, and there's all sorts of different ways that you kind of take it on its own terms. Because again, when you understand it, it's not crazy. It's clear that the Constitution does carve out a space like that for the individual. But what struck me is Alito's thing was basically, yeah, no, that's bogus. That's not there, and like done and done. Which, okay, that maybe that's your final decision, but you kind of owe it to everybody to make an argument on its own terms why that does not wash. And it's not impossible to do. A lot of smart people have done it. There's actually a book by a guy named John Hart Ely who died many years ago. It's a book named Democracy and Distrust, and one of the early footnotes. Alito actually he's footnoted. Ely is footnoted in I can't remember if it's the Democracy and Distrust book or one of his articles. Anyway, this guy is Ely is a very famous constitutional thinker who died at a relatively young age, a few decades ago. The point is, there are smart people who've made these arguments, and Alito didn't even feel the need to make the argument. Just like no and no. And like I said, kind of, put you up over my head, spin you around, and then throw you down onto the mat. And there we are.
Yeah, and what I think it is an interesting juxtaposition that's in the text is at the same time that, like you say, he's kind of clawing back this personal autonomy right and spends a lot of time saying there's no historical basis for this in our country, which is kind of a whole other can of worms to get into. But while he's making that argument, he's making the parallel argument for fetal personhood. So basically saying that kind of, you know, grown born humans do not have this right, yet a fetus has all these rights, and he's really not particularly subtle about this. And, gotta say, the reason this is important is because anti abortion activists have largely coalesced behind fetal personhood under the 14th Amendment as their best legal pathway to outlawing abortion nationwide. So the fact that he uses the word personhood straight out in some points in his historical section. He slips in a little argument that perhaps fetal personhood was enshrined in the law of the 19th century. He talks about how viability is a totally arbitrary line for when a fetus becomes a person. And, the logical extension of that is, so why can't it be at the point of conception,
Right.
which would undergird the fetal personhood idea. So that is smattered throughout this kind of, and he does this other kind of insidious thing where he keeps uh, using the phrase, unborn child, but he's saying, or as the law before us puts it, and then it infuses all this anti abortion language in there. And that has been a part of this crusade for years. Anti-abortion activists are slowly kind of eliding the idea of fetus and child, bringing them closer and closer and closer together, and using little rhetorical flourishes like unborn child or potential life. It's in the same playbook as their other stuff of calling abortion murder. Alito also uses the word abortionist to talk about abortion providers, which at this point has become so freighted in that same anti-abortion world that it carries those same connotations. So he is making very clear that at the same time that he's pretty happy to claw back the civil right, he's also all for giving way more rights to the fetus. And that's really important. And I think the biggest question we're kind of left with at this point is, how many of the other four who voted with him endorse this fetal personhood language? Because we don't know if those four have signed on to this version of the draft, or we know that they voted with him, but
Right.
we don't know that
Right.
they've signed off on all the language. So if they have, and you can pretty safely say at this point that Clarence Thomas also endorses fetal personhood. He had another concurrent opinion in 2019 where he was talking about the eugenics stuff, but he referred to it as racial genocide. So that shows it pretty clearly.
Hmm.
Um, and it's obviously not a stretch to think that Barrett probably does, but we just don't have a lot of data points for where they come down on fetal personhood.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm still a little unclear, and I think this is just we don't know. My sense was, and I'm trying to think if I know this or this was just the sense I got when the
Mhm.
article when that piece dropped on Monday night. Um, my sense was that they were tentatively on board with this language. I mean, it's not final because it's not the final draft. Um, but I got the sense, and again, maybe this is just not true. I got the sense that it's not just that five of them agreed to overturn Roe, and they just said, Alito, write something up. We'll see what we think. Right?
Go
I think,
nuts.
yeah, I think it was a little more than that. That this was, that they had, were generally on board with this kind of opinion. Obviously, there are. It's. I'm not up on the exact practices they have, and I was never an expert on them. But it's not like uh, it doesn't work like, well, we had the vote, back in March, and it's done. Sorry, Neil Gorsuch. There's lots of cases in history where kind of something seems to decide everybody's on board, and then there's some kind of back channel conversations between the justices, and someone says, you know what, I no, I changed my mind. Um, the things change over time, and yeah, I mean, there's two things. The Look, there is a reasonable there's an intellectually coherent argument that says, you can be totally pro-abortion rights, but the Constitution just does not address abortion, and you can't get there. Those arguments about privacy and stuff, that's just not how the Constitution should be interpreted. So the court just has no, the court has no legitimate way into this discussion. Ergo, Roe was a bad decision. You get rid of Roe. I'm not saying I agree with that, but there's a coherent argument you can make there. But this stuff about fetal personhood, that's at least as alien to the Constitution as a right to privacy is. I guarantee you that doesn't come up. That is the whole. I mean, for what it's worth, to the extent that it is relevant, this whole idea of is a fetus a legal person at conception, no one in the 1790s would have any idea what you were talking about if you said that. Partly because they just didn't think in those terms. Also, they just didn't have the scientific knowledge. So it's all nonsense. It is all totally alien to the Constitution if you are going to take that perspective, that we need to deal with things that the Constitution either explicitly deals with, or that we know that they were in a conversation about at the time when they wrote certain language. The other thing, though, is Alito keeps coming back to, uh, if he basically says, if you're going to make up new things, they've got to be in the history and tradition of America. And then a thing about, and with an implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. Now, that phrase ordered liberty goes back a long way, but it's taken on very specific meanings in the late 20th century on the right. But again, history and tradition, the American history and tradition, that's another made up thing. That that's certainly not in the Constitution, history and tradition. And Again, that's another made up thing that, as he describes it, is highly elastic in its meaning. And my take on this was basically, it's almost like a new version of like a grandfather clause. Kind of like, if it was icky in 1930, don't bring it into the conversation in 2020, right? The kind of, sort of tradition it's a traditionalist argument masquerading as an originalist argument. There's an originalist argument to be made, but the traditionalist argument is at least as made up as the privacy stuff is.
Yeah. And I think an interesting thing about this is thinking about how the conservative justices have long kind of communicated with the anti abortion movement in their writings. Clarence Thomas does this all the time. There'll be years where you have kind of single Thomas dissents where he's communicating, I'm open to this and more, get it on my desk kind of thing. And now Thomas is in the majority. So those things are reaching his desk. And it's interesting to me to look at this text as that communication device, because now it's not just lone dissents or kind of law articles. It's a majority opinion that's knocking down this 50-year right. And within it is providing a blueprint for the anti-abortion kind of legal world to be like, and here's what you should do next, and we'll be down with that because 5 of us have signed on to this. It's just, it's quite brazen. Everything about it is brazen in a way that the court hasn't really been operating until recently, until they got this super majority and really have seen to adopt the attitude of they don't need to make particularly rigorous arguments. It doesn't have to be really textually based or historically based. They just kind of throw around the parlance and make their decisions, if that. I mean, or they just use the shadow docket and do what they want. So,
Hmm.
I mean, it's
Hmm.
all of a piece, but these are just, I think, the largest stakes we've seen so
Yeah, I
far.
mean, as long as we're sort of, sort of piling on with Alito, one of the other things that jumped out to me is, there's this doctrine stare decisis, which is it's a mispronounced Latin phrase, and it basically means all things being equal, you let precedent stand. You try to avoid overturning precedents because there is a broader stability of the law that there's precedents and you don't just go undoing them. And how much that's a priority is, those are the devils in the details, but that's the doctrine. And at one point he addresses Alito addresses the stare decisis argument, kind of like, hey, this is settled law, 50 years, like maybe you don't agree with it, but whatever. And he basically says, well, you got to understand what stare decisis really says. And he basically goes on to redefine it as, if there's a precedent, well, you got to go back and make sure the precedent makes sense. And if it makes sense, you know, then you keep it. Well, that's not, that is definitely not what it says. The whole point is, it is a sort of a prudential argument that you don't look that closely. You kind of say, look, it's been around a long time, so we're going to set a really high bar for you know for changing that. And he just kind of defines, he just sort of defines that out of existence. And again, for what it's worth, when we talked before about the way that when the Supreme Court overturns a big precedent, they usually do it within the reasoning of the opinions they are undoing. And the reason for that, again, is stare decisis. That, we're gonna, yeah, we're overturning it, but we're gonna sort of do it within within those. So again, a prudential respect for it's not tradition exactly, it's precedent, which is, there's a lot in there. It's good to be the king, and they're the king now, and they can do whatever they want, and that's the whole thing. That's the
Yeah.
whole thing.
So let's talk about kind of the political side of this for a minute. We already briefly talked about that Republicans have all coalesced behind being outraged about the leak as kind of the biggest breach in an institution, in our lifetimes, and really, really not being interested in talking about the content of the decision for reasons we already kind of discussed. I saw that a Newsmax anchor last night said that in his a professional opinion, he thinks it was probably Ketanji Brown Jackson behind the leak, which is just excellent. It's like, yeah, she probably hasn't even been in the building yet, but it was probably her, for reasons he can't figure out, he can't divine. She seems suspicious for some
Right,
reason,
right, 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 right.
Um, but so is this do you expect the Republican playbook to kind of hew to these lines, just this insistence on talking about the leak, or is there going to become some point where they just can't help themselves, where they do celebrate this
You
win?
know, my sense is that I think this issue is so big that at the end of the day, it does not matter much. You can like maybe the Republicans are going to win this leak argument. I saw a lot of people saying that like yesterday. Oh, they're gonna make this into a winning issue by winning the leak argument. Well, you know, I think they can win the leak argument, whatever that means, and it just doesn't matter. It is so central that is just gonna that's a kind of an asterisk, a minor footnote to this whole thing. I think that the what it is the role that it is playing right now is that this is the news. This is the news in American domestic politics. Everybody's asking about it, everybody's talking about it. So Republicans are constantly getting asked about it and they need something to say. And their preference would be, I mean, look, they're already winning the midterm. They've got inflation, they've got, critical race theory, all the different things they're talking about, and they're winning. So they don't want this. They don't want to talk about this. And so the leak thing gives when someone says, "What do you?" Well, the leak, blah blah blah. It just sort of as a politician, you never want to just be running from the reporters or running from the cameras, and this is giving them something to say. So it's sort of a placeholder since they don't want to talk about the substance. Uh, but really, I don't think any of that matters because
Yeah,
again, people have very strong feelings about this, and that's the real issue.
yeah, and I think it does stem from this idea that Republicans have in the past successfully kind of hijacked conversations and made it about procedure, and that really preys on a weakness of especially congressional reporters, because they know a lot about the procedure and the procedure is interesting to them, so it's easy to get caught up in. And in this case, who leaked it is like pretty interesting. It's not super important, but it's interesting. But
No,
I
it's a
agree
it's a
with you.
classic DC parlor game. It's
Exactly.
fascinating to think about what the thinking was of whoever did it, what they
Mhm.
were trying to accomplish, what the consequences for them might be, and
Right.
I would say they're pretty severe. Um, uh, a clerk. It certainly. I mean, if it is a Democratic clerk to speak kind of awkwardly about it. It is certainly true that that person would probably become a folk hero among progressives, but I guarantee you, their career as at the highest level of clerking and the legal academy is would be done,
Right.
totally done. So the consequences are vast, and like maybe you want to be a folk hero, but like if you've spent you know, uh, uh, years getting the grades that you need to get in college to get into the law schools that get you one of these gigs. You didn't do it to be to there was that woman a number of years ago who I think she worked for Planned Parenthood and uh, she did some congressional testimony. It had to do with reproductive rights, and she became sort of a cause celebre. Now I can't even remember her name. The point is, the professional consequences are vast, even though there'd be a period of folk herodom. And at the end of the day, as I think we know for all the other reasons, the leak doesn't matter that much. It's like a
Right.
6 week head start.
And also, it's funny because with the folk hero thing, like if it is a liberal clerk, that is a way in which the political media asymmetry just would not serve that person. The way that if you're kind of a folk hero on the right, you get to be Kyle Rittenhouse and you on Fox all the time, and now maybe you'll run for Congress, and like you're kind of set. At the very least, you
Or
could do the diamond and
you're gonna
silk
have your own
thing and have a YouTube
podcast or
channel.
talk radio
Exactly.
show, and you're gonna be making a nice six figure salary at least for the rest of your life, just milking that
Right.
forever. Whereas on the other side, I mean, there's some of that. There's some of that. People get, but like basically after 6 months, you're done
Right.
and you're back to being just you.
Yeah, but yeah, I think the driving force of this is, even though the procedural stuff is interesting and kind of, wonky, and there's always that, what if it was a justice, It just, the news is so high wattage that it eclipses
Yeah,
it eclipses
it's
the leak.
and one of the uh for it to go beyond the status quo ante on abortion rights, in which, as we said, there are in practice no abortion rights in large parts of the United States. When you talk about in practice,
Mhm.
can a woman without a lot of financial means easily access a legal abortion, within an hour's drive? Lots of the country does not, doesn't have that anymore. For it to get into the electoral realm, you have to have a significant number of people who, maybe I wasn't going to vote, maybe I was, or maybe like, I'm kind of down on Biden. Maybe get a little checks and balances on him by voting for a Republican. That you get, if you do you get a significant portion of voters that say, no, I want this abortion thing to be done, and we're going to codify Roe and whatever. That's a big question. And that is a question that is, either really going to define this midterm or it's not. And the leak is just not, you know,
Right.
doesn't matter.
So let's talk briefly about kind of what Democrats are doing and what they can do before we move to questions. So we have had, I think, a pretty systemic Democratic expression of outrage since the leak happened. We got a Schumer Pelosi statement right away. We got the White House's statement the next day. We have Elizabeth Warren kind of joining the protesters in front of the Supreme Court. Now we have Schumer announced that they're going to hold what kind of amounts to a symbolic vote on a bill that would codify Roe, which will be filibustered. And even if it wouldn't be filibustered, probably wouldn't even have the votes among Democrats to pass. Um, but we're also now starting to see the kind of inevitable flood of think pieces about, will this galvanize Democratic voters for the midterms? Will they harness this energy? How will candidates kind of loop it into their campaigning and all of that? So, where are you standing on that side of things?
Well, uh, I can't predict the future, but I feel like I know about as well as I know anything that if you are going to have this galvanize Democrats, if you're going to have it be a potential game changer in terms of the midterms, you need to right now have the president and the congressional leaders say something like this: if we hold the House in November and add 2 seats in the Senate in January, we will pass a law codifying Roe, period. Now, to do that, you need to, I think I said in a few posts yesterday and then today, um, you've got two different issues. One is you need 50 senators who will vote for a Roe codifying law. And I think to make that doable, you don't do, Roe is not a statute. So, but you basically need to make it Roe as it existed in, 1 year ago. And that we're, because once you open, because that wasn't great, but to get everybody on board, that's how you have to, I think that's how you have to do it. Um, you need to, you need 50 for that. You need 50 to amend the filibuster so you can do it with 50 votes. So those are two things you need 50 on. And it's not entirely clear to me whether that means you need to add 2 senators or 3. I think probably 2. But again, in the caucus, you don't have to guess. You just do a head count. Who's on board with this? Who's on board with that? And then you get it down to hold the House, add 2 Senate seats. Again, maybe you find out it's 3, then it's 3. But you find out what it is, and you say, and the president says, if I get those 2 things in January 2023, we are passing the law. We're going to pass it within the first week of the next Congress. I don't know if that's going to, And those are both heavy lifts in this political climate. So I'm not saying I know it's going to work, but I'm sure it won't work if you don't make it that clear cut, because that takes it out of all like, oh, but we already gave the Democrats the majority, and the Democrats, decided not to do anything and all this kind of stuff. Or you have the majority. You have the majority now. Why aren't you doing it now? Well, you don't have the majority, all that kind of stuff. If it's going to be a game changer, you have to do that. Otherwise, it will not be the central issue. It just won't. It'll be important. And a lot of it will be the most important issue for a lot of people, but without that clarity, without that specificity about exactly what is required and exactly what the commitment is, it's just not going to break through in the way you would need it to break through to accomplish those two heavy lifts.
Yeah, you can almost kind of see campaign signs that are like, hold the House, add 2 senators, pass abortion rights.
Yeah,
And I,
House plus two, right? I mean, there's
right.
lots of ways. You got to make it really clear like that.
And I think the other thing that will help here, and we discussed this kind of briefly on our Twitter conversation, is just there is it's not just a reactive thing. The threat is real, like we talked about with fetal personhood. This idea that people who have this earnestly held conviction that abortion is murder are going to be like, well, half the country doesn't have it, so that's cool. And we'll just like rest on their laurels is kind of insane. And that contingent will keep pushing the lawmakers and judges that are responsive to it. So it's not just, it does have just a very forward looking idea that the threat is real, that it's going to grow, and that this is not the end of it. You need that safety net. And I think that helps Democrats be perhaps a little less reactive. And like we talked about yesterday, Democrats sometimes have this idea that playing off people's fear is tawdry. That's something that the right wing does. That's something that Fox News does. But there's also valid, valid fear that's not just kind of this evangelical white grievance, like pretend victimhood thing. And the idea of having civil rights rolled back, that's a thing that people should be
That
afraid
you
of.
should
So
be afraid of.
harness
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, you should be afraid of it, and it is incumbent on politicians and elected officials to warn you what's coming. One of the big You hear this a lot when people talk about with Trump. Oh, Democrats got you know self-satisfied because they just had the fear of Trump. They didn't have to make an affirmative message. Well, the fear of Trump, avoiding the reality of Trump, is in fact one of the most central and important things in our politics. It's not some kind of like, oh, you tried to make fancy food, but you just put a lot of sugar and butter in it to kind of, to do it on the cheap or something like that. Fears that are real are entirely legitimate as politics. And again, with this, now I have heard some people say, well, what makes you think the Supreme Court won't invalidate that federal law? I think there's a decent chance of it. I
Yep.
think it'll take a while. I don't think they'll be ready to do it right away, but will they will they move in that direction? They may well. There's a very good chance. But then you come back to the Congress can take certain issues out of the court's jurisdiction. The Congress can say these issues are being walled off from the Supreme Court. The Congress can say we're adding more justices. They're you I am always I always get frustrated and impatient when you explain, well, if you want to change things, you got to do X, and say, well, if you do X, they'll just do Y. It's just very low energy. You can't. You basically, I'm not even going to try because they'll do something, and blah, 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 blah. That's a loser mentality, and this isn't just a matter of like kind of buck up, have a stiff upper lip. There are other options. There are options that have not been employed before, that have not been seriously considered, but there are definite, entirely legal, entirely constitutional solutions to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think any of this is predicated on pretending that having a federal statute is as good as having a constitutional right because I mean, it's not. The
It can
next
be
time
changed.
there's a
Yeah,
Republican trifecta, that law could go right out the window. But right now, the options Democrats have are, add a few more senators and pass a law codifying Roe, or add 10 more senators, get rid of the filibuster or keep the filibuster in place, blah, 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 or ask voters to give you a trifecta and to hold that trifecta until one of the Supreme Court justices dies, which might be, years from now. So of that menu, this just seems the most campaignable and the most messageable, even if it's an imperfect solution.
yeah, and I mean, I mean that's in our system. That is, if you're feeling powerless, if you're feeling this is unjust, it's unfair, that's the path. And it's not an easy path in this climate. It's not at all an easy path. And
Right,
that's
because the
really,
built-in unjustness and unfairness of these institutions.
yeah, I mean
But
all the different stuff. It's a tough political cycle for Democrats. But that's the path. And it's
right.
not, it's not like saying, well, all you have to do is get 75 Democratic senators. You say, well, okay, all you need to do is build a ladder to the moon. It's not a heroic thing. It's not a ridiculous thing. Parties pick up 2 or 3 seats. It's doable, and take all that energy, and this is the path, and that is um that's where to channel the energy, because right now, I mean, these are all they have 5 seats and a cushion. And yeah, Roberts doesn't want to completely overturn Roe, but pretty much. This 15-week thing basically makes, I mean, we're going to get into all the mechanics of when you actually even know you're pregnant and all this kind of stuff. um but you're not going to get satisfaction with the court anytime soon.
Right.
So this is the path.
All right, so let's take a question. This is from Carl, who says, if Chief Justice Roberts believes the leaked opinion overturning Roe came from conservatives to either push him to sign on or to prevent any modifications, how badly does that undermine his position on the court? Would he consider resigning at some point? This is an interesting question, too, because it kind of hooks on something we've talked about before, which is that the Chief Justice is not so much the Chief Justice anymore when you have this conservative supermajority.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I do not expect him to resign. I mean, he may resign at some point. He's not, I mean, I think he's in his mid 60s or something like that. I certainly don't expect him to resign over this. I don't expect him to resign over anything, but as you say, the I it is a it's a black eye on his chief justiceship, as it has been understood through history, that what is unquestionably probably the most consequential and historic decision of his his justice, Supreme Court chief justiceship, will be an issue that he was in dissent. As you said, you're kind of not quite chief justice anymore, at least in you're first among equals, but still you're kind of supposed to be leading. And it's not even a case where um you know it's not like this is if if Justice Breyer was chief justice. Well, of course he's not going to say, well, I guess I got to vote to overturn Roe because I can't be in the minority. But clearly he's anti-Roe. So it's got to put him in an excruciating position, just in terms of the dignity of his leadership position, to end up being on the dissenting side in the most historic decision, in a decision that he basically agrees on. It's it is so close. um you know what he wanted is so close in effect to what the five wanted, it shows that that their feeling is kind of like, yeah, whatever, dude. Yeah, your chief justice. Like who gives a crap? I mean, it's just he seems to hold no sway with them, and that's, again, I don't expect him to resign, but that I guarantee you that makes the process less fun
Yeah.
for him.
Okay, and then our other question is from Andy, who says, "How long is minority rule sustainable? I know it's the game plan with gerrymandering and voter suppression, but how long is it realistically sustainable? What's the tipping point? There are already more of us. What needs to happen?" And this is a question I've been like kind of obsessed with, especially in regards to the court. Ever since we saw those oral arguments and it became clear this is not going to be, you know, like getting into a cold pool one step at a time. It's going to be a cannonball for people who have grown very accustomed to these various ways of life. So, what is the tipping point? The only like kind of historical thing that springs to my mind is when, way back under FDR, when the court kept ruling against his New Deal programs and he got pissed and was like, okay, well, I'm going to expand the court basically. And then it kind of a backing off, but kind of also just a lot of the justices resigned and he could put his own people in there and then things got rolling again.
Yeah, well, it's one of these cases where for a long time it was thought that even though he failed at packing the court, that the justice was like, "Oh, okay, we're going to kind of fall in
Right.
line to be a little more cooperative." But in fact, many years later, when historians were able to go back and look at the history of the different decisions, they had there's a decision called Caroline, a footnote in a decision called Caroline Products, which basically overruled, uh, or kind of started the overruling of a lot of pro laissez-faire precedents from the beginning of the 20th century. And what became clear later on was that they had started to make that move before the court packing thing
Mm-hmm.
actually started. So it's a little more complex. But in any case, on the big question, I don't know. It's very complex because are there more of us? You know, uh, the only thing we have that are truly national elections, presidential elections, it kind of does seem that way. We know the history of, Republican hasn't, the only time Republican has gotten the most votes in a presidential election going back more than 30 years is 2004. That's pretty telling, but it's still pretty close, right? It's pretty close. Um, and we don't, as Republicans love to say now, we don't live in exactly a democracy, right? We have sets of rules, and you kind of have democratic elections within those sets of rules, and they don't always get you to, the result that if you had a plebiscite, the most people would have agreed to. And so if it's close, it can go on for a long time because you get to kind of fundamental issues of, how close is it, and how central are the issues that are being held up, and how strongly do those people feel about them? Um, and is there a basic kind of crisis of legitimacy? And if there is a crisis of legitimacy, who's gonna who's gonna do what? Right? At a certain point, the whole system exists because the overwhelming percentage of the population agrees to operate within it and not resort to force in a civil context. Um, so I think the answer is that if it's close, it can go on for a long time. And it's the kind of thing where, um, if it were a kind of thing where, like, a Republican president hadn't gotten more than like 30% of the vote in 30 years and they keep getting put in, that's a different thing. But it's close. right? Um, and so I think it can go on for a long time.
A thing that's interesting is there was this piece actually from last year in the New York Times that kind of got re-upped yesterday among everything, and it was about the connection between backsliding democracies and the rollback of abortion rights. And it was interesting because if you have to think about it, that makes sense. You know, when would you think women's rights would get clawed back, right? It's like within the creep of authoritarianism. But what's really interesting is since 2000, per this article, only 3 countries have rolled back access to abortion, and that's Nicaragua, Poland, and the United States. And in every case, it's happened amid this like hyper partisan fight over the high courts in the country. Um, and it's
Interesting.
interesting. I mean, it's kind of just part of the trend of our institutions are increasingly
You know,
favoring, minoritarian role.
I have no idea what the situation is in Hungary, but I'm curious what the reproductive rights situation is in Hungary, because that's another kind of big democratic
Yeah.
backslide country, and it's democratic backsliding with a strong, sort of right wing traditionalist, cultural traditionalist thing. So I would kind of I would have expected there would have been back, but I don't, not up on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I
I
know there's
think
been a number of countries like Ireland, a number of
mhm,
countries where there's obviously moves in the opposite direction.
right.
Um, it's an interesting thing. The U.S. is, there are there are a lot of ways that the US is just pretty different from countries that it is often classed with. And
Mhm.
by that I mean, you know, the big Western European industrial democracies, Japan, Australia, Canada, all these, they're different. It's and in some ways that, you know, uh I think we can all feel great about, in other ways that are, could, we could up our game a bit.
The other piece that I think just does play into this question is the fact and plays into how Democrats react to this is that it has been a slow, inexorable march for Republicans to get to this victory on Roe. And in a lot of ways they've been aided by our institutions that favor the minority. There's no way around that when all but one of the justices who have joined this majority opinion were, appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. All of them were confirmed by a Senate that senators that represented fewer people than the ones who voted against them, all of that. But there's also just the laser focus on the state level that Democrats haven't done, which is like how you get in place legislatures that will pass this crazy legislation that, gets up to the court and all of that. And, the, you know, there's a piece of that that is just not cheating, not gerrymandering, just having a different political focus that has
Yeah,
now really paid off. And
yeah,
that is what I think is kind of hardest. That piece of it is hardest to reckon with now because that was a lot of work and they kind of got all their wins and now they have all their people in place and now they can gerrymander and make sure that those wins are solidified
yep,
forever.
yep.
And that's a part that is harder for me to grapple with than say, passing federal legislation because that is, even though Democrats are still disadvantaged on the national level for sure, it, like you say, it's close enough that you can feel pretty confident that Democrats will. Yeah, I mean, they're in power now, but you know what I mean, that they would get in power again.
Hmm.
But in these lower levels, I mean, I don't know what you do because unless there's some kind of over real like court intervention that like knocks down the gerrymandering or something, because they're just really entrenched.
Well, one thing to keep in mind, and it has been a kind of a received wisdom over the last 15 years or so, that Democrats just got lazy and Republicans took over the states, and all these terrible things have come from it. They weren't paying attention to this, they weren't paying attention to that. And there is a significant amount of truth in that. But there is a reason historically why, not progressive in our current sense of the word, but more progressive political movements in the United States have always looked to the federal government, always. And the reason is that there are basic structural and sociological reasons why conservative elites tend to dominate the state governments. They just do. Not always, not every time, but in general, they just do. And so for more than a century, it has been key to, again, in the most expansive sense of the word, progressive political movements of all stripes, that you got to operate at the federal level because there are structural advantages at the federal level that more egalitarian, more progressive political forces can kind of, get the commanding heights and overrule the state elite, state conservative conservative elites controlling governments at the state and at the state and local level. One of those reasons, if you get really deep into the sociology, is that in a lot of ways, for all of our talk about town halls and grassroots and all that kind of stuff, that the more local you get, the more you tend to have an equation between social and economic power and political power, right? The big cheese in town, that person, yeah, everybody's got a vote, but that person really kind of calls the shots. And there's a lot of reasons why that's harder to pull off at the federal level. So there's a reason why, conservatives have been talking about federalism and state, not just state rights in the kind of the really scary sense, but just federalism and decentralization and, moving stuff back to the states and stuff. The point is, it's not just because Democrats got lazy. There are progressive, egalitarian political power has for ages in the United States, in some ways, always. They need to operate at the federal government because that's where their advantages are.
Right.
In any case, I guess that's about it. We've covered. We have produced a lot of quality content, even though not about the most happy news. But remember, the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off with the promo code TPM, Grady'sColdBrew.com. And I guess that's it. We'll be back next week.
All right. See you next week.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.